Good evening, everybody, and welcome to School Psych Podcast. We are very excited tonight to be talking about executive functioning. We've got a very important guest here who is very knowledgeable, so we're going to go into that. Before we get going on introductions and topics and what we're get into the meat of the discussion here, we first wanted to talk about the presentation that's going to be presented tonight is a PowerPoint, and so you can access that through our Google Resources Drive. And I really quickly just wanted to show everyone how to access that in case you're unsure. So bear with me as I'm going to do a little screen share here, and hopefully this will come up. So this is our Facebook page, and this is where you can access the Resources Drive. It's also on the Google Plus page, but if you scroll down to Impressum, and then you click on here, see more on Impressum. Here's the link to the Google Drive. I have lots of people that email me saying, oh, can you give me access to the Google Drive? You don't need access. It's an open drive. So all you have to do is click on this link. It's going to open up here, and this is kind of going to be what you see as far as here's your resources folder. Here's just some information on the podcast and how to access the drive and whatnot. You can open in your own drive and add this to your drive so that you have quicker access to things. And when you do that, it kind of looks like this. This is my drive here. Here's those documents. I'm going to click on resources. This is all our resources that we file away. Please email me if you have anything that you want to contribute. Absolutely. And so the presentation for tonight is going to be in our executive functioning folder, and it's right here. So you'll be able to access that. You'll be able to download. You'll be able to print it off, open it, you know, do whatever you need to do. So feel free. So I'm going to turn it over now to Rebecca, who's going to talk to us a little bit about how you can participate tonight and ask questions and be a part of the discussion.
Yes, thank you. I'm Rebecca. I'm a school psychologist in the state of Connecticut, and I'm really going to be looking forward to your questions, comments, ideas, thoughts, anything you have. There are two main places that I'll be looking on the Facebook page. Actually, on Facebook, there are two places. Our School Psyched podcast page, when you click on the page, you'll see that our last post was the link for tonight's episode, so you can just comment right under there, or you can even post a message to that page. Also, the other Facebook page, School Psyched, Your School Psychologist, you can comment under the episode reminder that I posted earlier this evening, or you can message me as well. And on Twitter, using the hashtag PsychedPodcast, please feel free to post there, and I'll be looking for your questions and comments, and we'll direct them right to Dr. Rebeck. Anna, you're going to tell us a little bit about our poll?
Yep, we have a poll on our Facebook event page, and we asked what kind of measurements do you guys use for executive functioning, and the winner, so to speak, was the brief. We have 27 votes for people that use the brief. A more newer rating scale is the CEFI, which is nationally normed, which is pretty cool. That got 10 votes, but a very informed viewer commented that those are not actually direct assessments. Those are kind of indirect rating scales. The two direct assessments are the DCAFs and the NEPSI, and those had 9 and 5 votes. So a lot more psychs are doing rating scales and doing direct assessments of executive functioning, but a lot of people are doing a lot of different things, so that's really cool. So we are involved, and we are observing and assessing, so that's neat. I want to introduce our guest, Dr. Matt Rebeck. He's a full-time school psych in Posey County, a board-certified school neuropsychologist, and he holds a national certified school NCSP, and he works part-time as an adjunct professor at the Department of Psych and at the University of Southern Indiana, where he teaches Intro to Neuropsychology and Abnormal Psychology. So thanks for joining us, Matt.
Absolutely. Great to be here. Thanks. All right, executive functions. I met Rebecca on the early career professional blog post through that NASP runs. She had a question actually about the card sorting task on the DCAFs. And I think the question was something like, how do I score this? Or, something like that. And when I saw that, I was like, there's no way I'm going to be able to answer this question through an email. I just don't think that there's just enough space in an email for that. So I offered to chat with her, and she gave me a call, and we chatted, and she just hasn't left me alone since then. Regretting giving out my number, but too late for that.
It's like a professor in your pocket.
And then she made this offer, and this is just something I really enjoy talking about. I could talk all night, all day about it, but I've been restricted to an hour. So whatever I don't get done today, I'm not going to try to rush through it or anything like that. So whatever I don't get done today, I'd like to, and we talked about it, come back, sometime to finish up and allow you guys to generate more questions or, anything like that at all, anything I can do to help out. So I've been a practicing psychologist for 6 years now, and I've been working at the University of Southern Indiana for 4 years now, or something like that. And I've been board certified in school neuropsychology for a year and a half or 2 years, something like that. So, all right, without further ado, here's the schedule of presentations. So a little introduction and definitions of executive functioning. Then we're going to focus on the biological basis of executive functions. We're going to look at the development of executive functioning. And that's definitely a very important area for us when we're doing observations, doing different kinds of assessments. Typical behavior for this age group will not be typical behavior for an older age group. And also understanding just kind of the developmental trajectory and trends of executive functioning can also help out with assessment. Okay. My slide hasn't changed.
Nope.
Okay. Okay. Let me see here.
Yeah.
Do you want to make it full screen? That way, maybe viewers can see it a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, that's what I did before. Okay. How about now?
Not yet. It's not full screen, but we can see it.
It's full screen on mine.
Well, that's weird.
Yeah, that's
All
right.
right, we'll roll with it, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, let me try something here real quick.
And I mean, it's posted in the drive, so people can bring that up. And
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it full screen now, or?
No.
No, and what we see is what you see down in the bottom. Do you see?
No, I just have my.
Okay, that's it.
No, we see the schedule of presentation slide 2 right now.
Okay, so you see this little
And then
area here.
Yeah. Schedule presentation. I'll let you know if it's stuck on a backslide.
Okay. Hopefully it doesn't get stuck. Okay. Well, showing some cognitive flexibility here with the technical difficulties. Okay. How about now? Can you see the new slide?
No.
Still slide number 2.
Darn.
So you can still see the schedule?
We saw your mouse and then it disappeared, so I don't know.
Can you see my mouse now?
No.
It might make sense to just keep it out of full screen and just to click down as you go, and just
Okay.
go
Like-
one at a time.
Yeah.
Okay, like this? Can you see it now?
Yep.
Yeah, we're on schedule presentations. So, yeah.
Okay, so you can see me moving around now?
Yeah.
Can you see my mouse?
That's
Okay, all right. We'll go like this then. All right. Okay, so development of executive functioning and then categorizing executive functioning within a report. Now that's going to be very challenging just because there's just not a global encompassing type of definition for executive functioning, and 2, there's a number of different perspectives within the field of school psychology when you're interpreting results. So of course that's going to determine how you categorize it to a certain extent. Some common executive functioning tests and of course interventions for executive functioning difficulties. Okay, so before I get started, here's a little story that I share with my students when talking about executive functioning or more general frontal lobe functioning. So you have you decide to have some friends over for dinner, but you do not have any food to cook, so you must go shopping. You have to work under a time constraint, must return home in time to cook for the meal. The cooking items are not in the same store, so you have to plan an efficient route and not get distracted by other items for sale or by talking too long with friends. So this has to do with planning and selection of options, ignoring irrelevant stimuli, and persisting until task is completed, keeping track of the stores and items you bought, and use of internal and external cues. So this has a lot. This really sums up executive function. So these kids with executive functioning difficulties, if you sent them out on a shopping task, who knows what you're going to come back with? You know, you may come back with some toys. You might not see the kid ever again. You know, those kinds of things. So, you know, if you're, and it might make you laugh a little bit to yourself, but you know, when you're suspecting a kid to have executive functioning difficulty, you know, before even working with them, when you're just observing him or her, or just chatting with him or her, think about sending them off on a shopping list and say, within 2 hours, you have to come back with this, this, and this, so you can start cooking. Okay. That is not a diagnostic tool, though, so don't look for that for many. Okay. So it's a very important part. Executive functioning is a very important part of our reports and of our behavior, of children's behavior, but sometimes it's an overlooked part of the assessment. And, you know, we actually had a little discussion before we officially started, you know, about the rating scales and direct assessments and those kinds of things, which rating scales, they are an important part of the evaluation, but it should not be considered an executive functioning assessment, and that's it. Just because we have somebody who probably lacks the training in psychology, child development, behavior, you know, all those kinds of things where they can misidentify types of behaviors for another type of behavior. Or, you know, if you have a parent that has to deal with, you know, a very challenging child, a hyperactive child, a behavioral child or teacher, you know, some of the ratings might be a little bit more elevated than what they really are. For example, go ahead. Yes.
In a report, we call those like those indirect measures, those rating scales. Can we refer to them as maybe like executive functioning screeners or something of that nature, just to kind of like, if we're not sure if maybe there's a problem and then something maybe comes up, to probe deeper? Or do you recommend that always give a direct measure?
Well, best practice says, you know, to give a direct measure, but you also have to function within the scope of your training and understanding of executive functions. You know, as Rebecca knows, the DCAS can be very, very complicated. You know, especially if you don't have any kind of formalized training or anything like that with assessment and with scoring it. And there are some other options that I'll get to sometime about training specifically for the DCAFs and NEPs and, you know, those kinds of things. And it kind of depends on what you're looking at for the rating scale as well. You know, if it's part of RTI, you can use that to help drive Tier 2 type interventions, and that can be used as a screener. And then if the child then is referred to Tier 3 or referred for an evaluation, then you can use that as part of your report. Now, this is just personal preference. You know, the way I categorize my report is I do the direct executive function assessments first, and then I report the rating scale last, but still in my EF section of my report. And then I use my direct assessments and my observations, and I compare that to what others have observed, and then see if there's alignment or if there's misalignment, and then explain why there is that misalignment. So, long answer to that question, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, great. Now, with these kids with executive functioning difficulties, you know, we know there's something going on with these kids. You know, like obviously they're not achieving as they should, but then when we get them one-on-one setting, or you know, we help control for those other outside factors, we find out that they're very intelligent. So why can't these kids, these very intelligent kids, function in the classroom? You know, usually it's because of these executive functioning difficulties, which we'll get into. Now, especially for older populations and any kind of neurological type cases. With the older populations, as we age, our frontal lobes or our executive functioning systems come online, especially 12 and above is when they really start coming online, and that's also when we are expected to be more and more independent in the classroom, doing things on our own. So when you have these older children, older students, junior high, even high school, that they didn't have any kind of learning problems in their elementary years, but now we're getting these referrals for these kids in junior high, high school, that they think, well, I think this kid has a learning disability. That could be it. But chances are that there's other combinations going on. There might be a little bit of emotional stuff going on, maybe some ADHD behavior, maybe some executive functioning as well. We have that tendency to think in terms of these neat little boxes. Is it anxiety? Is it depression? Is it a learning disability? Those kinds of things, where in fact it can be a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, a little bit of column C. But then when you put those all together, then we get difficulty with academics.
So Matt, when you are thinking about an older child, middle schooler or older, beginning to show signs of executive functioning weakness or concerns about that, do you see that as sort of a developmental lag? Do you see that as a red flag that might necessitate a screening for ADHD? How do you think of that? Like, if it hasn't shown up until that point?
Mm-hmm. Well, if it hasn't shown up to that point, then what that tells me first is that chances are it's not just a pure learning disability. A lot of times those kids are going to be identified early on. I'll look at the emotional stuff going on. There's a lot of times that the older kiddos will have some kind of emotional stuff going on. Parents getting divorced or moving around a lot, or anything like that. And I look at how that affects their emotions, and then I also then look at their executive functions and talk with the parent, talk with the teachers, talk with the principal, those kinds of things. And sometimes I'll go through like a little checklist that I have, or just ask questions about executive functions, those kinds of things. Except the thing is, when we're asking, or when we're interviewing, asking these people these questions, we have to translate these executive function type questions into layman's terms. Instead of saying, Mrs. Principal, do you feel your child has a shifting attention problem or shifting cognitive set problem? You ask them, well, how well do they do with transitions?
Right.
Do they seem anxious when things do not quite go the right way for them? Are they very unorganized? Do you know, when you're working with them one-on-one, do you know that they have more skills than they're able to show? If we're looking at more of an executive function disorder, disability, however you want to word it, it's not necessarily a question of a deficiency in knowledge, but it's a deficiency in performance. They have difficulty showing what they know, even though they do know it. So I kind of probe those kinds of questions, and then when they give me a call or make first contact with me, I translate what they say into my fancy psych terms. Okay, like the executive functioning stuff. Has child A has severe meltdowns when there's fire drills, or anything like that. And then see right away, then what that says to me is, all right, we could be looking at some anxiety issues, maybe some attentional shifting type issues as well. And then I look into that further.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's see here. Our initial understanding about executive functions came from patients with frontal lobe insult or frontal lobe dysfunction. Now, Phineas Gage is the most famous case. He was a railroad construction foreman, and prior to his accident, he was described as being hardworking and quiet. And then after his injury, he had very poor control of his behavior, almost like he was a different person. And actually, I have some pictures of Mr. Gage. Now, when we were first learning about executive functions, there was the single boss hypothesis, which it was kind of the one CEO that controlled all executive functions, which is probably unlikely that there's many bosses that control the individual executive functions. And depending on what kind of model you look at, and we'll get into later, Dr. George McCloskey categorizes 32 different kind of self-regulatory executive functions. So by his perspective, all 32 of those different behaviors have their own boss, which would be very expensive to pay on Boss's Day. But anyway, this also explains the multiple CEO perspective. Also explains why you can have some children do well on certain kinds of executive function tasks, but bottom out on other kinds. Okay, so here is Mr. Phineas Gage. So here is the steel rod that blew through the left side of his face and out the top of his head, and he survived this, but it obliterated his orbitofrontal. Yep.
The slide didn't change, Matt.
Oh, there we go.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
So there's just a lag in time?
I guess so, yeah.
Okay. I know, and I work so hard to get these pictures too.
We see it
Okay,
now.
so okay, great. So as we can see, the steel rod came in through the left side of his face and out the top right portion of his skull, and completely obliterated his what's called his orbitofrontal cortex, which has a lot to do with the integration of social cues and social context for behavior. And here's an actual picture of him, I assume holding his steel rod, and he used to be a nice guy until he took an iron rod to his left frontal lobe.
Matt,
and this picture down here.
Matt, I think you have to click the screen share button one more time.
I see it.
Okay.
You see it? You do? I don't see it.
Anna, do you see it?
Yeah, I see it. It's there.
Okay, now I see it.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay.
Oh, okay. All right. Let's see here.
There
Okay.
he goes.
How's that?
Yeah, I see him.
We good now?
Handsome
Okay.
guy.
You can see my mouse move? Okay. And this one, they managed to catch Phineas's surprised look on his face when he took the steel rod through his head. So, okay. So when we're looking at executive functions, they're really the top of the hierarchy, I guess you can consider, as far as cognitive skills. The more complex the task, the more brain areas involved, and that's why it's very important to control for lower cognitive skills. So just keep that in mind, and I'll talk more about that when I talk about the assessment of executive functions. But they're the most complex, so that means that there's more stuff that can go wrong. Okay, when we're looking at just like motor functions, sensory processing, those kinds of things, even though those are complex tasks, they're simpler tasks than our executive functions. So there's less that can go wrong. Now, the idea to keep in mind with executive functions is it's the difference between divergent and convergent thinking. Okay, convergent thinking is one way to answer, such as on the whisk. We have, the vocabulary. What is the hat? Yeah, there's a few variations of the 2 points that you can get, but it's pretty much the same thing. Block design, there's a little bit of variation, but pretty much here's the picture, here's some blocks, don't eat them, and go ahead and make this picture. Okay. Now, your divergent thinking is there's many different ways to get to the answer. Here is a picture of a tower, and here's the discs, and now it's your job to mimic the picture, as with the tower test from the decafs. So convergent thinking is primarily affected by posterior lesions. So our IQ tests are assessing more convergent thinking, and our executive functioning tests look at more divergent. That's why you can have these kids, when you give them full-scale IQ of whatever your preference is, that they do very well. But then you put them in the classroom and they look lost because you take away that structure. And your divergent thinking is more affected by anterior lesions or dysfunction, your frontal lobes. So in my opinion, this kind of looks at testing beyond the IQ. And the older method is, you give them an IQ, maybe a supplemental test here and there, and you're saying, yep, they have an IQ of 115, and I have no idea why they can't write a paper and turn it in. Okay, so it tells us more about what the child, or the area of weakness for the child. Again, that will help with interventions. And here's just another way to think about convergent and divergent thinking. The Office Cat, one of my favorite little comics here. We're going to have to think outside the box here. I just pooped in it. So your divergent thinking is thinking outside of the box, okay? And your convergent thinking is thinking in the box, okay? All right. Okay, definition. So the definitions part is, it's a little bit difficult to define just because it depends on your theoretical orientation. It depends on your perspective. I mean, there's literally thousands of definitions out there for executive functions. In Dr. McCloskey's book, Executive Function Assessment, I think there's about 7 pages dedicated to just definitions. Here's some. Oh, I forgot to do a proper citation there for that, so I do apologize. One definition is the control and coordination of cognitive processes during performance of complex tasks. Dr. Miller defines executive functions as a set of divergent capacities that facilitates a person's ability to engage in purposeful processing of perceptions, emotions, thoughts, and actions. Dr. Dehane defines it as an array of mental processes responsible for regulation of cognitive function during purposeful, goal-directed problem-solving behavior. And a more simple definition is temporal organization of behavior. So, we're looking at behavior, and we're looking at some kind of goal-directed type behavior is really the main point here. Now, McCloskey has actually defined executive functioning as 6 interconnected concepts. One, executive function is multiple in nature and does not represent a unitary trait, so that means the multiple executor type of perspective. Directive in nature, used for cueing and directing other mental constructs, so that's the boss feature of it. Executive functions cues. Oh, I got a little feedback there. Does someone have a question, or?
No, that's just the beeping going on in my house. Sorry.
Oh, okay. All right. Your house has had enough executive function. Your house has lost attention. Okay. Okay. Executive function cues and directs mental functioning differently within the 4 broad constructs. So he broke down the constructs to be perception, emotion, cognition, and action. And executive functions can vary across 4 arenas of involvement: that's interpersonal, intrapersonal, interpersonal, environment, and the symbol system. Symbol system is the academic area. Executive functions begin to develop very early and continue to the 3rd decade of life, and the use of executive functions is reflected in the activation of neural networks within various areas of the frontal lobes. So really, what Dr. McCloskey has done here is he's taken a look at the 4 broad areas and the 4 area arenas of involvement, and that really allows us to have a very, very good understanding, a very good profile of the child's behavior, where it can explain, well, the child has very poor inhibition when he's trying to reach a goal, but when he's learning, the inhibition is good. So you can have executive dysfunction in one area but not in the other. So it just all that really just helps out with being as specific as possible, because again, the more specific that we are, the better the interventions will be.
Yeah, well, Matt, so would you say when there is a dysfunction that is that split on a wire that way, that it's just a matter of missing skills? So that dysfunction is a missing skill and not like a neurobiological weakness?
Well, I mean, it depends. It depends on, if there was any kind of significant history that could affect the development of the frontal lobes. If there was in utero exposure to toxins or anything like that. There's a lot of times if there's nothing significant in the history like that, if they're just delayed, then they just need more time. You just need to reteach those skills. There's that misconception that kids who have behavior problems, that we should treat them differently than kids who have academic difficulties. The classic line is, well, he's 13, he should know better, or he should turn in his homework, on his own. Well, yeah, you're right, he should, but he's not. So whatever we're doing now is not working. So we need to provide that structure, that support, and we need to intervene as if this was an academic area. Yeah, all kids should be at grade level by junior high in reading, but they're not. So we look at where they are academically, and we build them up from their current baseline skill. If we look at these executive function skills in that same lens as, yeah, it's behavior, but they can't help it, that we need to take a step back and say, where is their baseline functioning, so then we can target interventions to improve this organization, to improve this planning, to improve blank. That's the key to doing that. And then the other key is to convince parents and teachers that as well.
I love that, though, because then it comes down to teaching and not assigning like blame for what's going wrong. It just comes down to what do we need to teach. I like it. It's
yeah, exactly. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, so definition still. Okay, so within McCloskey's definition of executive functions, there's 5 tiers. So there's self-activation, which is waking or ramping up. So that's like just when the kid gets up in the morning, how quickly does it take them to get with it? There's some of us when we wake up first thing in the morning and we try to find the snooze button and we knock over everything on our nightstand except for our phone or our alarm clock. That's why we cannot perform even those basic cognitive functions, let alone more complex cognitive functions, until our cortex is completely aroused, until we're awake. So you're working with a kid. Okay, that's nice, but what does it mean for how we help kids? Well, if you're working with the kid first thing in the morning, or if they're having a lot of difficulties first thing in the morning, but then later in the afternoon when they have a chance to wake up a little bit, or later in the morning when they have a chance to wake up a little bit, we don't see those same difficulties. They might have a difficulty with self-activation. We can't expect them to perform these higher functioning skills if they're not awake. Okay, and then of course that plays a part in, well, did they sleep well last night, and et cetera, those kinds of things. Then the next step is the self-regulation, and that's your daily function. So that helps you function in your daily life. There's the 32 identified behaviors. And then self-realization and self-determination kind of takes you a step beyond the day-to-day functions. So that's when you start setting goals and plans that extend past your daily functions. Setting goals about, I have an assignment due next week, I need to start planning for that. Self-generation, the nature of existence, meaning of life, and personal philosophy. Why are we here? Those kinds of things. Asking the big questions. And finally, the trans self integration, sense of oneness and ultimate truth. That kind of reminds me of like a Zen Buddhist type thing. You can even compare this to Maslow's hierarchy levels as well. And it's a hierarchical perspective, so it's not a hierarchical. Maybe except for a little bit more of the self-activation. If you're not awake, you can't think about your philosophy on life if you haven't had your coffee and Cheerios yet. You can move through these stages without mastering the previous. Like for example, your self-regulation, daily functions. You can have horrible planning and organization where you lose everything, but you can still think about the bigger meaning of life and your personal philosophy. But there's some things that are going to make it a little bit more challenging. If you are writing your memoirs about your personal philosophy, but you keep losing it because of poor organization, that's going to get in the way of that. Okay. Did you guys see the screen change?
Yes, I think so.
Good. Okay. Great. All right. Now, like I said before, there's 4 domains of functioning that McCloskey identified: perception, emotion, thought, and action. So you look at these executive functions and you look at, well, how does that work with their perception, with their emotion, thought, and action? There's some things that are a little bit easier to assess than others, and that's why doing a real good interview, just chatting with the kid, getting a better understanding of the child instead of just these test scores that we get, can help you out with the perception, emotion, thoughts. Action is pretty self-explanatory there. That's what we see. So the executive functions can be intact for, okay, I got that. 4 arenas of involvement, the self-regulation with domains of functioning. So this is the interpersonal, intrapersonal, interpersonal, environment, and symbol system. Okay, so the intrapersonal is the internal states, how they perceive themselves, how they think others perceive them. The interpersonal is relations with others and having an understanding of others' perspectives, and even the theory of mind, understanding that other people have a different perspective than their own. In their environment, the relation to the environment, cause and effect, and the symbol system is the academic area of functioning. Now, the 4 domains of functioning, the perception, emotion, thought, and action, are prevalent in the 4 arenas of involvement. Okay. Again, it just helps you have a better understanding of the true executive functioning profile. Now, the 32 different self-regulatory executive functions are divided into 6 clusters. Now, I'm not going to go through all 32 for you guys, but the different clusters are attention, engagement, optimization, evaluation, efficiency, and memory. So within the attention, there's focus and selective and sustained attention. For the engagement, there's initiate, inhibit, flexibility, and shifting. The optimization is self-monitoring and correcting. You can have a kid who's good at self-monitoring, but they still don't self-correct. In fact, I just had a girl I was working with that she was self-correcting mistakes that weren't really mistakes, but when she self-corrected, it was still the same thing that she originally put down, but she was wasting her time doing it. The evaluation, forming a plan, anticipation, what's going to happen next, why do I think that's going to happen next, and association. Association is very important because we use that to understand that, to take away the novelty from the situation. Yeah, this is a new problem that I'm looking at, but it looks a lot like the problem that I had to solve a couple hours ago. And let's see, I'm going to look at my memory and we'll say, okay, I tried this plan and it worked, so I'm going to try something a little bit similar. So you're associating what worked before in the past with what you have presented in front of you. Efficiency is a sense of time, pace, and execute. I have a 7-page paper to write, and I'm going to get started on it an hour before class. That's not a very good sense of time. And of course, there's memory, is holding information, manipulation of information, storage, and retrieval. Okay? Right. Okay, any questions before we go with the biological basis? As I take a drink here.
Yeah, take a drink. What came to mind, and I know we're going to get to assessment later, but just thinking of the rating scales and the DCAFs that I'm familiar with, there isn't really a comprehensive assessment that speaks to each of those 32 different areas. Is there?
Oh, no, that'd be a very long test. And the thing too about executive function, is that you can have a test that loads heavy on, let's say, planning. But at the same time, you also have to inhibit a more salient or a more automatic type of response. You have to be able to attend to the directions. You have to be able to hypothesis test, or test your hypothesis. Learn from feedback. Utilize internal, external cues. Those kinds of things. Where very rarely, especially with executive functions, do we ever have a pure assessment of blank. There's almost always other factors that play a part in the child's performance on the task. And the trick is then when the child performs poorly, you have to say, well, what is it? A very basic example of that is you could have a kid that does really poorly on block design, but then when you give them block design multiple choice from the WISC integrated, they do a lot better. So because they did better with still a same visual spatial task, chances are it's not a visual spatial deficit. It's something else. It might be, in this case, motor programming. Okay? So you have to look at these different scores and say, all right, we got a low score here, but why? There's another example. It's one of the case studies, actually, of a little girl I just got done working with that I gave her a bunch of planning assessment stuff from the cognitive assessment system and from the WISC integrated. And she bottomed out on the WISC integrated. It's called Ellithorn mazes. She bottomed out on that because she had difficulty maintaining or holding the set of rules in her mind. Now, with Ellithorn mazes, there's about 3 different rules you have to keep in mind. You're not allowed to cross a barrier. You have to keep moving forward, and you can't pick up your pencil. So she had to keep in mind all 3 of those tasks while performing the task. And I found that same kind of deficit throughout her task. So that was the main underlying cognitive deficit, but then that affected only part of her planning. So, in the classroom, if she is trying to formulate these plans for these complex tasks, well, she has to remember a bunch of these rules. She's going to forget those rules, okay? And so she's going to make careless mistakes over and over again because then she's overwhelmed. She has that poor self-monitoring then because of that, because she's trying to remember all these different rules while performing the task. So the important thing is to just look at the your assessment findings and kind of look at it as the big picture and see what is some of the main underlying functions and how has it affected these different areas and these academics.
Right.
Okay, biological basis. The frontal lobe involvement, but it's not a singular frontal lobe system. The location is the most anterior part of the brain, or the frontal part, and it's in front of or anterior to the central sulcus. And the frontal lobe is very big. It contains anywhere from 25 to 35% of the whole brain. So it's a very important part of the brain, isn't it? It's also the least lateralized part of the brain. Okay, so what do I mean by that? For the majority of the population, about 90% of the population is right-handed. The majority of the right-handers and even about 30% of the left-handers, or I'm sorry, not 30%, 60%, they have the speech zones on the left side and more visual spatial stuff on the right side. Now that's a very simplistic type version, but we'll just kind of keep with that for now. So that's what I mean by lateralization. One hemisphere is designated to have this function and the other one is designated to have this function. But dysfunction or injury to the frontal lobe seems to greatly affect all kinds of executive functions, not just isolated behaviors. Okay. Now, what it is believed, though, is that the left frontal lobe is more involved with the encoding, and the right frontal lobe is more involved with retrieval of information from memory. And when there's bilateral injury, its time orientation is usually off. So, when we're talking about these brain areas, don't think of it in terms of absolute, but think of it in terms of neural systems. They're all part of a system, or like a string of Christmas lights. It just so happens that the frontal lobe is the biggest and brightest part of these Christmas lights when we're talking about our executive functions. But injury, dysfunction, the light bulb burning out at a lower level will cause the rest of the strand to burn out as well. So it won't work if we're looking at complex executive function tasks, such as like the tower task on the decafs. If you have that very poor visual spatial functioning, you're probably going to do poor on that task, but not necessarily because of poor executive functions, but because of poor visual spatial processing. The prefrontal cortex is also the most evolved part of the brain, along with the posterior parietal area, which there's very strong connections to that as well. So here's just our little picture here, color here for everybody whose their attention is fading off. So as you can see, right here is our central sulcus. Okay, that's a big divider between anterior and posterior part of the brain. So here's our whole frontal lobe here. So it takes up quite a bit, doesn't it, of the cortex. So it's probably pretty important for us to have those functions, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the frontal lobe also has very strong connections to the rest of the brain, especially subcortical, and again, like I said, the parietal association area. There's 2 main association type areas of the brain, kind of where all the input is directed. There's one in the posterior part that has a lot to do with their sensory information or input information, and then there's the output information in the prefrontal cortex. Subdivisions of the frontal lobe. So we have like I said, the main function of the frontal lobe is output of behavior. So we have the primary motor cortex, which takes care of the basic motor functions, like tapping your index finger to your thumb, those kinds of things. The premotor cortex is more complex movement, and it has our movement lexicon, and also our mirror neurons, and is involved with external cues. Now, our mirror neurons are very important for our development of theory of mind, understanding that others have a different perspective than our own, which helps with learning empathy, and also helps with just socialization. There's a lot of time our kids with behavioral difficulties, socialization difficulties, kiddos on the spectrum have poor theory of mind because of those mirror neurons, is what is believed. Then the dorsal part, or kind of the most top part of the premotor cortex, is called the supplementary motor cortex, and that reacts to internal cues. So within our frontal lobe, we have kind of an internal cued system and an external cued system. And there's a lot of times with these kiddos with executive function difficulties, especially like the poor attention, poor inhibition, impulse control, that their internal cued system is off. So they overly rely on external cues. And then when they're overly reliant on external cues, then they are more driven to more automized type stimuli when they become impulsive then, or they respond incorrectly because they lack that kind of the internal cued system, or the even that internal speech type system. Okay. And then, of course, then there's the prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of higher ordered cognitive tasks and emotional regulation. All right. So children with, and some studies here, but children with, it's called phenylketonuria, or PKU, have reduced dopamine in the prefrontal cortex area, and they have impairment on executive function tasks. So there's the main hypothesis is, dopamine, along with other neurotransmitters, glutamate is a very important one as well, but dopamine is the fuel, I guess you could say, for a lot of the frontal lobe systems. Significant damage to the prefrontal cortex can result in switching ability equal to that of a 3-year-old child for adults. Okay, and injection of a dopamine antagonist reduces executive function performance in monkeys. So a dopamine antagonist would be something like our antipsychotics, which block dopamine. Or it could even block the synthesis, or the making of dopamine. So we have this evidence that kind of links with that dopamine hypothesis with executive functioning as well. And that also explains why for some kids who we put them on a stimulant, that some of their executive functions increase, or their abilities increase. But medication is only part of it, that we still have to teach those behavior type strategies as well. Dr. Miller has identified 5 frontal and subcortical type circuits. It's the first one's a skeletal motor circuit, which is involved with movement, which includes dexterity and higher ordered motor programming, and ocular motor, that's movement of the eyes, visual scanning and tracking, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that's your classic executive functions, your orbitofrontal cortex, that's your emotional states. So that is your Phineas Gage, and anterior cingulate, your believed to be your center for apathy, and inferior temporal posterior parietal area, which has to do with working memory. Okay, so here's some of our areas here. Here's our cingulate, or anterior cingulate cortex up in the front here. Here's our orbitofrontal cortex, and here is just a breakdown between the 2 motor areas and our prefrontal cortex. And here's our frontal eye fields. Actually, Luria found that patients who have sustained frontal damage, they had a very unusual type visual scanning. So if you have poor visual scanning, then reading sight words is going to be difficult. Finding information within a complex array is going to be difficult. Those kinds of things. All right, so here's kind of a summary from Miller, but here's our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex circuit. So our functions of anticipation, goal setting, planning, monitoring, use of feedback, focusing and sustaining attention, generating a hypothesis, maintaining or shifting, initiation of behavior, visual spatial search strategies, and motor programming. So damage, decrease verbal retrieval. So a kid might be able to encode and learn information, but they cannot pull it out quickly or at all. Okay, then they need those cues. Poor motor programming. That's complex motor movements. Motor programming is important when we're learning to write words. The most basic motor program that we have is our signature. It's kind of like the speed dial on a phone, that we don't have to think about it. We just push the speed dial and we go. Okay, I've got a request here. Okay.
Yeah, Matt, I just sent you a message because.
Okay. Yeah, I'm getting caught up in the science. Okay.
Yeah, aware of the science. So I was hoping that we could also make sure to at least get to, even if we have to have a, even if hopefully we will have a part 2 or a part 3 coming up for the really complex and interesting science background. I'm wondering if we could also get to some of the, like the day-to-day, how we apply this to our assessments in school and the
yeah, sure.
Assessment and intervention.
Sure.
Okay,
Okay, all right. All right, so how about you want to just go to categorizing, or do you want me just to go to the functioning tests and go through some of that?
Sure.
Or just straight to just intervention?
These look deep too. Well,
okay,
maybe
we'll
because. Yeah. Go ahead.
Interventions?
I think so. I think that would be really helpful, I know, to me.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. All right, so we'll do that. Okay, so here's just to break up the monotony of me rambling on and on. The sever frontal lobe, but still makes plans. So that is our goal. We want these kids who have these difficulties with these executive functions, whether it's developmental, whether it's through injury. We want them to still be able to make plans. Poor bad luck Brian, he wants to start thinking about the future, but then he damages his frontal lobe, so he's going to need a little bit more help with that. And here, I guess kind of going with some of a perspective on executive functions without having the training in it. But yeah, I would like for you to start using your frontal lobe. That would be great. Or if you could, sometimes we ask kids that though. Yeah, that's funny. Lumberg, it's always a good comic relief. But some of these kids with these poor executive functions, we don't actually remediate these functions. We just say, hey, start using your frontal lobe, kid. Let's go. And they're like, well, I don't know how. Teach me. Okay.
Yeah.
So I got this from Miller. So all these that I get this information from there, it's in the back on my references as well. Cognitive flexibility. It's difficulty with transitions from one activity to another, tendency to perseverate or get stuck, and difficulties letting go. Okay, so this can manifest in one of two ways. We have the cognitive type of poor flexibility, and we have the emotional type. Okay. So some examples of poor cognitive flexibility. You give a kid a story problem, and they solve it the wrong way, and you give it back to them, and you say, this is wrong, solve it another way. So what do? They solve it the exact same way. They get the exact same answer. I don't know what's going on. I got the exact same answer. So what they're doing is they're presented with this problem, they solved it incorrectly, and you give them a problem again, and they solve it just the same way. They lack that flexibility of thought. Or they solve a story problem one way, which is incorrect. You give them that structure, and they solve it correctly, and then they go on to the next story problem, and they go back to solving it incorrectly. What happened is it's the same basic type of story problem, but it's a different kind of story problem. So what they have to do is it's that association where they say, well, this is similar, and I tried this perspective before, so I'm going to try this new perspective here. that's similar. Now, another way to look at this too is if there's like a math sheet with a bunch of addition and subtraction problems on there. And we've all seen those, like one's addition, one's subtraction, then there's 2 addition, 4 subtraction, 1 subtraction, 1 addition, you know, those kinds of things, which is just horrible for our ADHD kids and our kids with executive functioning difficulties. So kids with poor cognitive flexibility, they're going to add, they could, or you know, it could be cognitive flexibility, you know, attention, maybe they're rushing through it, but they're going to add every single one of those problems, even though they have to subtract on some because they got cognitively stuck on the first thing that they did. Concept formation. All right, now this is, according to Miller, this is very important with learning, relating new information to previous. This facilitates storage and retrieval of information, and concept generation is problem-solving action, while concept recognition is problem-solving component. So with the decafs, oh, do you have a question, or is that just a dog?
Sorry, that was my dog.
Well, does the dog have a question that I can answer?
Actually, Matt, I hate to ask a question because there's so much I'd love for you to keep talking to, and we're getting close to the end of our time. But I do have a question because these interventions that you're going through right now make me think of the difference between some kids who kind of learn some of this implicitly, and then kids that need the explicit teaching. And kind of like I don't know if it's a theme in my head or if I'm getting it from what you've been saying so far. Can you talk about the difference between implicit and explicit teaching for like 30 seconds?
30 seconds. Okay, so you're adding a time constraint. Yeah. You're adding that structure for me. Okay, yes, I do need that. Okay. Now, has the 30 seconds started yet?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So implicit is, you know, or explicit is, or no, I'm sorry. Okay. Implicit is when you directly teach them. I believe. Or am I getting this mixed up?
Explicit is when we would notice a child exhibiting behaviors that suggest cognitive inflexibility or difficulty with concept formation. So then we would kind of have to dial back and explicitly teach a skill, whereas maybe some of these executive functioning difficulties, when they don't show up, it's because kids have kind of along the way implicitly learned these.
Oh, okay.
Is that right? Okay.
And you know, and the kids with the better executive functions, they've been able to be able to use these skills that we teach them into novel situations. That's kind of the main theme here, and with these executive functioning tests too, because they're very novel. You know, that the kid has never really done this before, so we take a look at how they approach a very new type of task, and what their strategies are. You know, and then other factors then play on how quickly then they learn this new task. And there's a lot of these executive function tasks that you can look at the rate of learning, or like learning to learn the strategies. You know, if you have a kid that's very, very slow in learning to learn and very, very poor with these novel skills or novel processing, then you're looking at more of a difficult type of skill, executive functioning skill. You know, if you have these kids who are really poor with novel tasks at first, but then they do a really good job with learning to learn, and they pick up very quickly, and then they can associate to new tasks, then these kids are better off. These kids are just going to need a little bit more structure to begin with, but then you can let them go. You know, a couple of examples, those kinds of things. The former example, those kids are going to need a lot more structure because they have those difficulties with association.
Right. That makes sense. There's so much more we'd love to ask you and talk about tonight. So we're really hoping that you will come back on for a part 2 and maybe even a part 3.
Yeah, we'll just make it a trilogy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe we'll do a prequel too sometime.
That sounds really good. So if there's one, is there anything you might want to say, kind of just to wrap up? Because
any questions?
I don't think we've had any come through, right, Rebecca? We've had some comments, maybe?
Yes, we've had some comments that some people are just really enjoying the conversation, and we're getting, like I was, so interested, but also kind of a little mind blown with the science part. So that was a supportive question on that.
Sure.
It's a lot to absorb. But it's really interesting, and that this is really good was a nice comment that we got as well. So
good.
So we're gonna wrap up. Thanks, Dr. Matt, again for joining us, and
not a problem. Thanks for having me.
Intelligence into this conversation.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I just say enough words, and they get strung together in the right way, and we'll just go from there.
Yeah, I bet you're really much better at that supermarket task than I am.
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, if I see a picture of a brain or something, I'll just get distracted, and they won't see me for a couple days. But
that's funny.
So we're going to close up now, and Matt will be in touch about scheduling part 2. And our next,
absolutely.
Right now, our next scheduled podcast is October 25th, Sunday, with Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, who hosts the Psychology podcast. We're very excited about that. So put that on your calendars, and we might have Matt in between, depending on timing. We'll see, or maybe next month. We'll see how it goes. But thank you guys for chiming in and joining us. And Rachel, congrats on the new baby.
Yes, new baby alert, and new puppy, Anna. Congrats on the puppy too.
All right, good night, guys.
All right.
Good night, everyone.